We're not reading it out of order. The dramatic order, I think Antigone was written first. It's the oldest, so these were not a trilogy. So maybe that's why they do it. But the order, the dramatic order, is clearly the order we're reading them in, because in the Oedipus of Colonus, Oedipus is blind and has been exiled from Thebes, and in the Antigone, he's dead, and she's, responding to the war between her two brothers, and so I was just thinking, what a big. I had argued, I still think that the most impressive character in the Oresteia is Clytemnestra, and part of the proof of that is that she's the only character that spans all three plays. But of course, Creon's the only character that spans all three plays in this group, and he's not the most impressive character, I think. Well, I think that there's evidence in the play that we have no reason to believe that she knows at the beginning of the play. But halfway through, it looks as though she's figured it out before he has, and that's why she doesn't want him to continue. So when exactly that happens, that'd be an interesting question to figure out when, if you can, when in the play she begins to wonder about this. But there's certainly grounds. You'll see, right? He walks into town. We're told in the play later that he looks a lot like Laius. He limps. He comes from, well, that doesn't count with her, but so he looks a lot like his father. There was an oracle saying that he was going to kill his father. After he came into town, his father, we'll see a problem with that too, but the father dies and Oedipus comes. So it wouldn't take much for Jocasta to start putting this stuff together. So I mentioned this several times. It is in some ways, it's not just for us, but it's the Greek tragedy. There are philosophers who, Hegel spends much more time on Antigone, Heidegger also on Antigone, but Aristotle mentions it, I think I told you, 19 times in the Poetics. Nothing else comes close. There are French versions by Corneille, Voltaire, English version by Dryden, Latin version by Seneca, French version by Gide, not to mention Aeschylus and Euripides. They're lost, but we know that they did write Oedipus plays. And of course, for us, there's the extraordinary influence that Freud had by identifying the Oedipus complex. And yet, for what is maybe the tragedy of the tragic poet in the tragic age, one wonders about some of the strange plot glitches that are present in it. Okay, so what's the sequence of action before the play? What's it supposed to be? So, first oracle. The son of Laius will kill, Laius and Jocasta will kill either Laius, if you look at line 723 on page 42, or both of his parents, if you look at line 1176 on page 63. Jocasta gives birth to Oedipus. She and Laius agree to kill him because of the oracle. So they pierce his feet with a pin and give him to a servant to leave out on a nearby hill or mountain, Mount Kithaeron. Notice Jocasta, who later expresses such disbelief in oracles to Oedipus, never has any doubt at all about what they're doing. Now the servant, who is a herdsman, can't do it. He takes pity on the baby and he gives Oedipus to another herdsman, nearby herdsman, who is a servant to the king of Corinth, King Polybus, who in turn gives Oedipus to Polybus and Merope, his wife, the queen. That's at 11, you get that information at line 1178 following. So they adopt him and call him Oedipus, literally swellfoot. So Oedipus, Oedipus, swellfoot. Now, what? Swell foot. So his swollen, he of the swollen foot. Not he has swell feet, but swell foot. So presumably they call him that because of his feet. Now Oedipus grows up in Corinth, and one day he hears a drunk say that he's not the son of Polybus and Merope. He confronts his parents, they deny this, so he's still suspicious and goes to Delphi to ask the oracle, and he gets oracle number 2, the oracle that says that he will kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus, hearing this, flees from Corinth. He believes enough to flee, but not enough to believe, in order to avoid becoming a subject for Freud. Now, he comes to a fork in the road on the way to Thebes, where he meets a party of travelers. There are 5 of them, we're told. The herald tells him to get out of the way. He won't. The person in the cart, the leader, obviously, of the group of 5, strikes him on the head with the goad that he uses to encourage his, I'm not sure whether they're, whatever is pulling the cart. So Oedipus, in a fit of anger, kills all of them over this traffic dispute. The group seems to be Laius and his retinue on the way to Delphi, clearly to consult the oracle. Interestingly, we're never told why they need to consult the oracle. Meanwhile, back in Thebes, after Laius leaves, but before Oedipus arrives, a monster, the Sphinx, who is part woman and part lion, is exacting a flesh and blood tribute until somebody solves her riddle. Her famous riddle is what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, 3 legs in the evening, and the answer is human being. Walks on, crawls as a baby, walks in full health on 2 feet, and then in old age needs to use a staff or a cane. So Oedipus arrives, solves the riddle, gets the kingship and Jocasta as a reward, and serves the Thebans well for what's got to be 15 to 20 years. He has, we're told, 2 daughters, and in this play, although later it will be specified in other plays, but in this play, an unspecified number of sons. Then, say 15, 20 years into his rule, a new plague hits Thebes. There are no births of any sort in the city, and no burials are possible. So Oedipus sends Creon, the brother of Jocasta, his wife and mother, sends Creon to the oracle to ask what to do. And it turns out that the cause of the plague is that Laius's murderers are still at large in Thebes. On Creon's advice, Oedipus sends for Tiresias, the seer, in order to consult him. This is where the Oedipus Tyrannus opens. All this information we're given retroactively within the play as we go along. So when messengers come in or when they're in conversation, you get a kind of picture of what had to have happened before the play opened. Now, some problems. There are always problems. First one, he claims that he killed all of the company, but one of Laius's servants apparently survived. That servant swears that they were attacked by robbers, plural. And of course, Oedipus knows very well that he was alone. This difficulty is not simply one that we see, but it's brought out in the play itself. Jocasta convinces Oedipus to send for the servant to sort this problem out. By the time he comes, that's at about 1110, line 1110, the incest issue has so overwhelmed Oedipus that he doesn't even ask about the discrepancy. Although the parricide question really turns on it, because if he didn't kill them, if they were killed by a party of robbers and not by Oedipus, then of course he's not guilty of killing his father, even if he is guilty of sleeping with his mother. Now, it might be too much to accept the coincidence of two meetings at one crossroads between Thebes and Corinth on the very same day where there are these two bushwhackings. That's not exactly what it is, but you know what I mean. But in a way, is it any harder to accept that than to accept the Gilbert and Sullivan coincidences that sort of animate this play? That's probably a reference you don't get anymore because you don't know Gilbert and Sullivan. But in HMS Pinafore, there is, the whole story turns on a switching at birth between the captain of this ship and Rafe Rackstraw, who is just a lowly sailor on the ship. And Rafe Rackstraw falls in love with the captain's daughter, but he can't marry her because she's of a higher class and he's of a lower class. So they have this terrible problem. But then it turns out that there is a nurse maid who nursed the captain when he was a baby. Her name is Buttercup. And Buttercup reveals that she inadvertently switched the captain and Rafe Rackstraw when they were babies. And therefore, of course, he can now marry her because it's perfectly okay for him to decide, I don't care about rank. I'll marry Buttercup even though she isn't really the captain's daughter because I'm the captain, because you get the whole silliness. But the real silliness, of course, is that the captain is like, I don't know, 50 years old and Rafe Rackstraw is maybe 21 or something. And so you've got this very strange, they just ignore it. They regularly do that in Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. And something like that's going on here because, in fact, what have we got? We've got this strange coincidence of the herdsman. When the guy comes from Corinth to the messenger comes from Corinth, it turns out to be the very same Corinthian herdsman to which the Theban herdsman had given Oedipus at birth. And lo and behold, the witness that we've sent for, who was on the road with the king, the herald who escaped, is the very same herdsman to whom the king Laius gave Oedipus to abandon him on Mount Kithaeron when he was a baby. So is it any harder to accept the possibility that there are two events on the road at one day than to accept this pile of coincidences? We need to see that on this robbers issue, Oedipus really jumps the gun. That he assumes that he was the murderer. He acts as though he knows when he doesn't really know. It wouldn't ever stand up in court. It wouldn't even stand up in Athena's court. It doesn't look like it's a description of the same event. The other really interesting thing is, of course, we buy into it too. We don't even notice it. We accept it just like that. Why? Well, we need a coherent story in order to make our time spent in the theater watching this thing make any sense. If he didn't do it, the whole thing falls apart. And what are we doing sitting here? So we have a kind of vested interest in making things make sense. And we buy into it. But of course, he buys into it for something like the same reasons, which means Sophocles is seducing you into doing the same sort of thing that Oedipus does. Second problem. We're supposed to believe that although Oedipus knew Laius had died, he's lived at least 15 years in Thebes, and no one has mentioned any details of this fact to him. He doesn't know Laius was on his way to the oracle. He doesn't even know Laius was murdered. He doesn't know that the Thebans never investigated the death of Laius. So when he discovers all of this, is it any wonder that he jumps to the conclusion that there's a conspiracy? There was a conspiracy in Thebes to kill Laius? When you get there, you've seen him fly off the handle so many times that you say, there you go again. You know, you're assuming this conspiracy. But actually, when you think about his situation, it's not so nutty that he should think something strange. Otherwise, why has all this information been kept from him for 20 years? You'd think some of it would have had to come out in ordinary conversation. Third problem. I like this one the best, I think. The marriage. Look at line 736 on page 42. Bottom of the page. How long ago is this? The news came to the city just before you became king, and all men's eyes looked to you. What is it, Oedipus, that's in your mind? So, Jocasta's husband is dead for what can only be a day or so, at most. Oedipus comes to Thebes, looking, we're told, remarkably like Laius and with swollen feet. He solves the riddle of the Sphinx, marries Jocasta with no mention of mourning for her previous husband at all. So, yeah, Oedipus knows that Laius is dead, but he doesn't know that he's dead yesterday. This version's a little tight on time, but at least the sequence looks right. But look on page 44. This is where it gets really bizarre. It's plain. Who was it told you this? The only servant that escaped safe home. Is he at home now? No, when he came home again, presumably when he came home from initially, when he came home from the accident, from the event on the road, and saw you king, and Laius was dead, he came to me and touched my hand and begged that I should send him to the fields to be my shepherd, and so he might see the city as far off as he might. So I sent him away. He was an honest man, as slaves go, and was worthy of far more than what he asked of me. So this version has it that the servant who is reporting the death of Laius comes back to Thebes to find Jocasta and Oedipus already married. This version has it that the servant comes back to Thebes, finds a murderer on the throne who looks like the former king, walks with a limp, and comes from Corinth. This is the servant, of course, who gave Oedipus to the Corinthian herdsman as a baby. The servant then runs away and so condones bigamy, regicide, parricide, and incest rather than be known as a liar. Now, all of this brings us to the question of the status of oracles in the play, and that, of course, means implicitly the status of the gods. Either Oedipus killed his father and married his mother, and the oracle is true, or he didn't kill his father and did marry his mother, and the oracle is false. Now, if it's not true, then the third oracle about the cause of the new plague is suspect. In this case, Oedipus would have discovered his real crime by unjustifiably having assumed that he committed another crime. not the oracle, but his will would be the source of his punishment. So, some tentative conclusions. The Oedipus Tyrannus seems to allow for two sorts of interpretations. One of them turns on his character. His anger, for example. The fact that, think about what happens at the crossroads. Now, the plot of the play is really only an instrument to reveal this, and so the puzzles, the knots in it, they don't seem quite so important. But the other interpretation, way of interpreting the play, turns not on the character, but the plot. And if it turns on the plot, it must refuse to ignore the puzzles and knots that show up in the plot. For example, through Oedipus's ignorance, we discover what we would really have to know in order to justify what we only assume to be the case. Now, the question of how these two levels of interpretation are related is crucial, because the first level gives us an Oedipus who is a well-meaning man who, through no ambition of his own, he after all is only running away from what he thinks is a terrible fate, through no ambition of his own is made king of Thebes, who's trying to avoid the most terrible of crimes. He becomes king, and he seems to be really quite a good king. Think about how this play opens. They come to him and they beg him for help. They treat him almost as though he's a god. So it looks as though he's done pretty well for the past 20 years in Thebes. The second level gives us an Oedipus who is the doer of all these crimes. This tension is really the double meaning of the Greek in the title Tyrannus. Is that not the, oh, I brought it with me. Okay. Means, on the one hand, just in the time, the mythical, I think I've mentioned this before, in the mythical time when the play is supposed to have taken place, it would just mean king. It wouldn't mean, doesn't have the connotation of tyrant. But if you're sitting in the audience in 5 whatever it was, when this play was produced in Athens, it means tyrant. So the auditors of the play, the spectators, have to hear both of those. Tyrannus, Oedipus Tyrannus means Oedipus the king or Oedipus the tyrant, and necessarily both of those things at the same time. So the tension between the double Tyrannus of the title is in a way the same as the tension between the two Oedipuses. On the one hand, Oedipus, the good king, and on the other hand, Oedipus, the man who commits the most serious crimes that human beings can commit. And it's not just, I mean, Plato picks up on this in his description of tyranny in book 9 of the Republic, when he makes it clear that, I mean, Freud would have loved this, the tyrant commits the crimes that the rest of us only dream about. But his goal is to show that he can do anything he wants to, and that means violating, it's fundamentally antinomian, not because he wants these things, but because he wants to show that he can do it. And for that, you have to pick out the worst things, and that would mean, you know, from most people's point of view, something like incest and parricide. Those are the worst things you can do, so I'll do them, and I'll show you can't touch me, and I'm above it all, and I'm not like the rest of you. The rest of you have to pay attention to these things, but I don't. So there's a kind of striving for an autonomy to be more than human. There are elements of that all over this. That's why Tyrannus tyrant is very much there. On the other hand, he really is the guy they come to and say, can you help us? You helped us before and you're so smart and we're not as smart as you are and you got that thing about walking in the morning and the midday and the evening and none of us could get that. So you must be able, since you can interpret poetry so well, you must be really smart. I want to say that again in case any of you didn't hear it, because never mind. Okay, so insofar as the two levels are brought together in the play, it will be by way of an act of will on the part of Oedipus. By assuming the many attackers are one. Despite the fact, if you look on page 47 at line 844, he himself says, you said that he spoke of highway robbers who killed Laius. Now, if he uses the same number, it was not I who killed him. One man cannot be the same as many. He articulates that as, I mean, that's his ultimate defense. We'll come back to that. Now, all of this is reflected in yet another way. His language always betrays him in the play. Sophocles makes him speak from the start as though he always already knows what he will later find out. So, for example, if you look on page 16, you get this beautiful case. He's talking to Creon. I may have to change it a little bit. Okay, line 120 following. Oedipus, what was it? If we could even find a slim beginning in which to hope, we might discover much. This man said that the robbers they encountered were many, and the hands that did the murder were many. It was no man's single power. And then Oedipus says, how could the robber dare a deed like this, were he not helped with money from the city, money and treachery? You see what he's just done? He slid from robbers to robber, which is what he's got to do in order to assume the guilt later, even though everybody's telling him it was robbers, it was robbers. He slides so easily in his language. He doesn't know that he's done that. Sophocles has made him do it in order to show that in a weird way he already knows what he will later find out. Line 260 to 65, he says, since I am now the holder of his office and have his marriage bed and wife, and had his line not been unfortunate, we would have common children. Fortune leaped upon his head. Because of all these things, I fight in his defense as for my father. And everybody in the audience is either gasping or sort of chuckling, and Oedipus doesn't actually know what he said. He can't speak metaphorically, even when he wants to. Without realizing it, he always speaks the literal truth. The overall problem, then, of the play is, in a way, this. Oedipus is a Tyrannus who is extraordinarily respected and a model of public spiritedness, a real king in the best sense. And Oedipus is someone who kills his father, marries his mother, and brings a terrible plague on his city. He's a tyrant. How are these two connected? Why is Oedipus the good singled out to commit parricide and incest? And if you look at line 1193, it gets even more interesting because there the chorus say, what man on earth wins more of happiness than a seeming and after that a turning away? Oedipus, you are my paradigma, my paradigm of this. Oedipus, you and your fate. He's the paradigm of it's even more pronounced in the Greek, the paradigm of the human. So why is Oedipus the good singled out to commit parricide and incest is connected to the fact that Oedipus is meant to be paradigmatic for our humanity. So in a way, we are in a way singled out to commit parricide and incest, and we need to figure out what he means by that. No, of course not. And in fact, he could be lying as you might expect him to do. That, I mean, how many times do you see this in the movies? We were, oh my God, we were attacked by thousands of people, when in fact it was, one particularly agile kung fu-y woman who, attacked you. So you're embarrassed by the fact that there were 5 of you and there were 1 of him. So you say we were attacked by robbers. So it's you can give a perfectly ordinary explanation for that, or you could say he might have, it's harder to say that he necessarily recognized Oedipus, because after all, he didn't know that he was Corinthian. He probably could see that he limped. He could have seen that he looked somewhat like Laius, but it's not clear that he would have necessarily put all that together. But when he comes home and sees Oedipus on the throne, Oedipus married to Jocasta, they don't even know Laius is dead yet. This is weird beyond belief. He sees that all of that has gone wrong, and the only thing he has to say to her is, get me out of here. I don't want to have to deal with it. You can understand that. You could argue that's sheer cowardice on his part, but it's also a kind of acknowledgement that we don't, you can put it this way, you can put it together, but you have to write another play to put it together. And that undermines your understanding of what is going on in this play. It shows you that the details of this play don't fit together in the way everybody assumes they fit together. And Sophocles has picked out this one thing that he's willing to talk about. He says, oh my gosh, look, robbers. Oh, and Oedipus at one point says, well, it can't be me, because plural can't equal singular. Therefore, one can't be many. Therefore, it's out of the question. So Sophocles shows you this plot glitch. But once you see that he sees it and sees it as a problem, you realize that all these other things that you see as problems are also problems, and they're not being acknowledged and they're not being put together. Now, he's a master of plotting. He doesn't make mistakes like that. He shows you he doesn't make mistakes like that by pointing out such a mistake in his own play. So at least at the beginning, what we have to ask is, why is he shown these? What's the point of showing us these obvious plot difficulties? Okay, so let's look at some text. Let's turn to the prologue. First speech. I'm going to change a few things, but not too much. Children of old Cadmus, newest brood, why do you sit here with your suppliant crowns? The city is heavy with a mingled burden of sounds and smells, of groans and hymns and incense. I did not think it just that I should hear of this from messengers, children, but came myself, I, Oedipus, whom all men call renowned. Speak, old one, since it is suitable by nature for you to speak for them. What do you fear or want that you sit here, suppliant? Indeed, I am willing to give all that you may need. I would be very hard should I not pity suppliants like these. So we've done this before, need to do it again. First word is tekna, offspring, children. And your first question is, of whom? Well, he tells you of Cadmus, but your first impression when you just see the first word is that Oedipus is calling them his children. And indeed, in the place that actually Green leaves out on line 7 and elsewhere, of this from messengers, comma, children, comma. So in fact, he does call them his children. But if they're Cadmus's children, of course, that means that that he's making a reference to the founding myth of Thebes, where Cadmus slew the dragon, took the teeth of the dragon, planted them in the ground, and out from the ground grew the original Theban citizens. So in fact, he's identifying them all as brothers and sisters. Except there aren't any women there, so he's identifying them as brothers right now. Now, that he calls them his children, not only in line 7, but look at line 7, but also line 58. Where's that? I pity you, children, and in line 142, where he says to them, come, children, take your suppliant bows and go. So yes, he calls them children of Cadmus, but he also calls them his own children. When he calls them children of Cadmus, he's identifying them as Thebans and identifying them as something that he is not. You are children of Cadmus. I'm not a child of Cadmus because I came from Corinth. Or he's identifying them as his own children. But in either case, he's suggesting that there's a huge difference between him and them. So Oedipus could solve the riddle of the Sphinx because he didn't fit into it. He was a middle-aged man who walked with a staff. He didn't fit the riddle. He somehow stands apart from it and apart from men. Remember, they come to him, they say, as though you are a god, but knowing that he's not a god. Or think about, if you look at line 729, when he makes his first remark about where the killing occurred, he says this. Of course, it doesn't say this in your version, but I'll change it. I thought I heard you say that Laius was killed at Triplice, Amaxitois, a triple road, a parting of 3 ways. He's the one who calls it that. Jocasta, for example, in the sequel says, focuses the country and the road there splits, one of 2 roads from Delphi. She calls it a fork in the road. So it looks as though he understands himself not to be, he doesn't even know he's doing it, but in a way, it shows up in everything he says. Ordinary mortals come to a place where the road splits, and they think of it as a fork in the road because they're on their way somewhere, and they're not simply going to turn around and go back. But he, on the other hand, in picturing it, pictures himself somehow above it, as though he can look down in the way a god would look down and say, well, the road breaks into 3. There are three possibilities. So he always sees 3 ways, where the others see 2. The sign of the problem here is, of course, in fact, he is the offspring of Cadmus. And so he's both father and brother to them. His fatherhood is, in fact, identical to his brotherhood, and he doesn't know it. So the incest problem is encoded in his very first word, tekna, offspring. That's all well and good, but what does it mean? I mean, it's nice and wonderful to see this incredible irony at the very first word of the play, but surely it must mean something more than just, it's there not just to sort of please us with our own intelligence. What does it mean? Now, look at the various ways in which he identifies himself with the city, with the polis. Green sometimes translates polis as town, line 4, line 28. In both of those cases, it's city, polis. So look, for example, at line 58. We get this. I pity you, children, you have come full of longing, but I've known the story before you told it only too well. I know you're all sick, yet there is not one of you, sick though you are, that is as sick as I myself. Your several sorrows each have single scope and touch but one of you. My soul groans for city and myself and you at once. Or line 93 should be more or less the following page for you, where he says, speak to all the grief I bear it more for these than for my own soul. Or a couple of pages later, line 135, he says, and justly you will see in me an ally, a champion of my earth and the God. For when I drive pollution from the land, I will not serve a distant friend's advantage, but I, the defilement myself, will disperse. And line 269, those who do not obey me, may the gods grant no crops springing from the ground they plow, nor children nor their women. You see how funny this is? It's after a long speech in which he's described what he's going to do in order to find out who killed Laius. And he says, if you don't obey me, may the gods grant no crops springing from the ground they plow, nor children to he calls a curse down on them. But you see what's weird about that, if you go back to the beginning, he acts as though he acts as though he's going to punish them, but in fact, all of this has already happened. That's the problem that he's supposed to be solving back on line 25. They announce that, look, Oedipus, can you help us? Because the earth won't bear any fruits, and there aren't any births, and there aren't any burials. So Oedipus says, you better watch out, and if you don't obey me, there won't be any births, there won't be any. So it's a very, he somehow assumes that he's responsible. And notice also the discrepancy that Oedipus is aware of in the play, the robber-robbers problem, that one cannot be many. You know, it's still there, I think, the Latin phrase on the dollar bill, e pluribus unum. What does that mean? Out of many, one. And what's it a description of? A country, right? You make one. So Oedipus says one cannot be many, and the dollar bill says, au contraire, Oedipus, you can have one made out of many, and that's what political society is. So that's interesting, given that he's constantly assuming. I mean, when they come to they come to him with this problem and say, boy, you think you feel it, but listen, I feel it for all of you. I really am the city in a way that none of you are. So his problem is really the problem of the polis. The polis always presents itself as, on the one hand, something altogether apart from its citizens, to which loyalty is owed, and the fate of which is more important than the fate of any particular. That's in a way Oedipus as father. On the other hand, the polis is nothing but its citizens, a collection of people who are in a way, in this way, equal to one another. Brothers and sisters, siblings. In the first instance, if you push it all the way, the polis becomes like a god, something that's worshipped, and so in a way disappears as anything directly in front of you. In the second instance, if you push it to its extreme, and in a way the city is nothing other than the people in it, it also disappears because it becomes nothing. It's just, the real thing is just the people in the room. In order for political life to exist, it has to be both of these things. It can't be, if it's simply the people and there's nothing more than the people, then what would it mean to owe loyalty to it? On the other hand, if it's the thing to which you owe loyalty, to the complete exclusion of your humanity, well, what? That's not a country. That's a Tyrannus. That's a tyranny, right? So it's got to be both. On the one hand, it points to tyranny, Oedipus as God, Oedipus as father. And on the other hand, it points to parricide, incest, killing authority, absolute egalitarianism. No distinctions make a difference. We're all absolutely equal. And you know that ultimately the mantra of absolute equality means, among other things, Plato saw this so beautifully in Republic Book 5. It means that, you know, incest, it doesn't mean anything. It's not, we're all individuals, and it doesn't matter where we came from. That individuality trumps everything, means incest is possible, and parricide is no worse than any other form of murder. So Oedipus reveals then in his crime the attack on legitimacy that underlies the legitimacy of all political life. He's both Theban and not Theban. He's both brother and father. He's one among equals, but prayed to as though he were a god. Now, one last thing. Both Creon and Tiresias characterize him as the angry man. So what does all of this have to do with anger, apart from killing people on the highway? However far anger gets from its origin in particular slights, and that happens. Think about the way ordinary fights between you and another begin and where they end up. I mean, they begin with very small particular things, and by the end it looks as though the whole world is at stake. They get generalized. So, you know, if you don't happen to weigh, so if you don't happen to like the toothpaste in the sink in the morning that never gets washed down, you know, and you just get annoyed at it one day, and you very politely, you know, request that somebody might do, and then somebody says, well, you know, you do, and then, well, I'm not so, I mean, that's the sort of thing you always do, and well, that's the sort of thing you always, so anger has this way of generalizing itself, so it turns into this huge cosmic thing, but as long as you remain aware of, at some level, of the particular place where it began, you are in a way constantly aware that, you know, it might have something to do with your own self-interest. But and therefore you're aware that it's not, potentially not altogether objective. Just think about how easily embarrassed you can become when you remember what a fight was really about. When you actually get away and you calm down and you start thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. But pure anger gets to show itself at Oedipus precisely because in speaking for the polis, he's allowed the illusion that he doesn't speak for himself. So perfect rule is, for us, impartial, selfless rule. The rule of law, according to the Eumenides. But of course, law doesn't really rule because it can't enforce itself. It has to be enforced by a human being, and so you have to ask the question, what motivates a human being to rule? Creon will give us one answer. He says, well, private gain. That's why when Oedipus accuses him of plotting this whole thing, Creon says, are you kidding? I get all the advantages now, and nobody thinks that I'm the ruler because you're the ruler. So I get all the advantages. I have none of the responsibilities. Why on earth would I want to be you? So Creon says private gain. Oedipus, on the other hand, represents a more interesting answer. Oedipus is the man who takes his greatest private satisfaction in suppression of the private. Oedipus somehow represents morality, the way in which you behave in a way that is constantly aware of its own selflessness, and you take enormous satisfaction in that selflessness. So he is meant to represent the danger of a man who is satisfied with being virtuous. And Sophocles has identified this sort of satisfaction with anger. He points to political life as the outlet for it. So the Oedipus Tyrannus seems to be about the way in which perfect devotion to the public sphere, to the exclusion of the private sphere, leads to tyranny. It's because Oedipus is so good that he can't see himself. His swollen feet, his Oedipus, which detaches him from human beings and allows him to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, gets in the way of his knowing where. Oh, I need his Oedipus, knowing where he stands. Sophocles knows this pun. Look at line 925. It won't be as clear to you from the translation, but let me read it to you in Greek. I said 925, right? I should have Aphrodite read it to you because it sounds so much more like a language when she reads it, but I won't. Aran par hemon oxenoi, mathoim hopu, tatu tyrannu domat estin oedipopu, malasta dauton epat te katis hopu. So what he's done in 3 lines is he said, essentially, this is the messenger coming. Can you tell me, do you know where the house of the tyrant is Oedipus? And once again, tell me if you know where. So in the pun, he's indicated that he's very much aware of the pun on Oedipus. If you just substitute another word for to know, you get oedipu. So in a general sense, this has to do with Oedipus's crimes because by replacing his father in his mother's bed, he lives a metaphor for self-generation, for autonomy, and therefore for objectivity. He's the man who always sees 3 ways instead of 2 because he doesn't see that he is what he is by virtue of already having taken one of these ways. He doesn't understand that he comes from somewhere. He didn't just pop into existence. Now, at the end of the play, in various ways, we'll come back to this, he repeats the problem because his self-blinding is an attempt to give himself nowhere, no place. So that in Greek is this, oude, poo. So you get Swellfoot, his deformity, nowhere, and nowhere. And in a way, the point of the play is that is to understand how these things go together. And there are a variety of places in which that becomes crystal clear. The beautiful one is, once again, the fact that for him to understand the place where the crime took place in the way that he understands it means to assume that in some way he's above it and doesn't take a part in it, that he's not on the road the way everybody else is, but floating above and looking down, that there's no where that characterizes him. And the interesting thing is that a man who believes that he's nowhere, in a way is not characterized by being nowhere and therefore objective because he's not looking at things from a point of view, but he's a man who doesn't know where he is. He's characterized by a fundamental self-ignorance, which in Oedipus's case, you could say, the very thing that allowed him to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, because he doesn't fit, it's in a way, it's a confirmation of the fact that he's not like everybody else. He somehow doesn't fit into the very categories that human beings are supposed to fit into. The very wound that he has looks as though it gives him a kind of detachment, but there's a place in the text, I'll try and find it for next time, where it turns out that it's an impediment, that he can't see in a way what's at his feet because of his swollen feet. He can't see where he is because the thing that is supposed to allow him to have this perfect vision is in a certain way skewing his vision without his knowing it in a peculiar way. So in a way, Creon is quite content to be selfish and knows that he's selfish and therefore doesn't presume to be objective. But Oedipus tries so hard in a way to be objective that it has allowed him to rule magnificently in Thebes for some 15 to 20 years. And the interesting thing is that Sophocles is thinking through the possibility that the very thing that allows him to rule so magnificently guarantees a blind spot that will be his downfall. That's why it's called tragedy, right? If he were just somebody who gets angry and, punches people in traffic disputes, he wouldn't really be interesting. You'd just avoid him, but he wouldn't be interesting. But he's interesting because it's because he's so good, much better than almost anybody, that he can be, that he's in a way destined to make this kind of mistake. Now, in the back of our mind should be this, always in the back of our mind should be this: Oedipus is not Sophocles. We should always be curious about the person who can write about this. You could say, you put it this way, tragedies are not designed, they are in a way designed to make you want to be Antigone. You can come away and say, my God, or Clytemnestra, what a magnificent woman. I'd like to be her. And then you immediately say, well, no, I really wouldn't want to be her because I don't want to be killed by thy son, and I don't want to actually die the way Antigone dies either. So maybe I should rethink that. But there's a part of you that really wants to be the tragic. So it doesn't work unless both of those are true. But there's another character here operating that we need to think through, and that is when you get out of, when you're finished with Hamlet, when you're finished with Oedipus the king, do you want to be Shakespeare? what does it mean to want to be Sophocles and not Oedipus? That's interesting. It's, by the way, what makes it really interesting however delicately and indirectly he does it when Shakespeare or any of these tragedians pull poets into their plays and ask you to think about the status of the poet. Have any of you seen, this is apropos of nothing, I'm just stopping now, but have any of you seen, what's it called? It's the British thing on it's almost Monty Python-esque. It's about Shakespeare. It's The Upstart Crow. It's really wonderful. I mean, I don't know if it's wonderful. You get through one season of it, and then it's sort of a one-trick pony, and you're not so happy with it. But it's a spoof, a farce about Shakespeare creating the plays, which uses references constantly to them. But he's sort of dumb, and he just keeps picking up things from his smart wife and the woman who owns the house where he lives in London, and his servant who is named, because I'm really dumb today, Bottom, right? So it's just if any of you know Shakespeare at all, find The Upstart Crow and watch a couple of them. It'd be fun. Oh, there are many different versions. Yeah, so you want to be, they do with these characters whatever they want to. It's like the many versions of Electra. So you want to be careful. It sometimes does that, it's both the benefit and the danger of looking up Tiresias, right? You end up with a whole bunch of references to him. You've got to be very careful to see. You get a lot of stuff, for example, about mythical characters in antiquity that comes out of Ovid, of the Metamorphosis. And of course, that's no good because it's Roman. So you need to make sure that everything that you use comes prior to the text that you're trying to interpret. And it's sometimes hard to do that. I think there's not too much that we have that's prior to this. There's some stuff. It might be in Homer. But we need to be careful about details. You get a story about it in Euripides, but of course that's coming after Sophocles. So the safe thing to do is to use only the information that you're given in the play. But your instincts are, there are two things going on here. One is that you're looking at a detail and you want to use that to make a point, but you also have an instinctive sense that independent of that there's something peculiar about his attack on Tiresias. It's much too harsh, and I think that's right. And what's interesting is what he accuses Tiresias of. By the end of the play, it looks as though Oedipus thinks that by blinding himself, he can turn himself into someone who's nowhere, rather than somebody who just doesn't see where he is. At the beginning of the play, he doesn't think that Tiresias is that kind of objective. In fact, what he accuses him of is precisely the kind of selfishness that he accuses Creon of. So everybody else but me, says Oedipus, is subject to self-interest. And Tiresias, you come from that tribe of prophets who are always taking bribes. And who bribed you? You're part of a larger conspiracy. Now, we want to be critical of that on the one hand. On the other hand, Oedipus has just said, listen, you guys are con men. I know how this works in cities. You don't have any more connection to the gods than anybody else does. And so when we put it in that way, it's not so off-putting, It's like the rainmaker. Somebody comes into town and says, I can make rain. And the sensible people say, yes, sure, you can make rain. You're just trying to get our money out of us. And in a way, that's what Oedipus is saying. And we don't credit him with that because we think, oh, these Greeks really believed all that stuff. Well, Oedipus has just shown you he doesn't believe it. On the one hand, and on the other hand, he's conflicted because he clearly believed the oracle and he's being pulled back to believe that he was unable to avoid the oracle. So it's complicated. And the status of our connection to the gods and of Tiresias' knowledge, that's all in play, I think. And this is meant to put it in play, partly in a legitimate way, and partly to show you that the man who thinks he's absolutely selfless is not absolutely selfless when it comes to defending his claim to be absolutely selfless. This is the moral man who tries so hard to be moral that he can't believe that he's anything but selfless. Well, I mean, literally, of course, it's Thebes, Corinth, and Delphi. There's a point at which there's a road to each of them, and they meet at a point. It'd be interesting to try and work out what that means in terms of what Thebes, Corinth, and Delphi point to, but the general point seems to be that it's a very awkward way to talk about a crossroads, because it's not very awkward, it's perfectly, but it's not the natural way. The natural way is you're walking down the street and you say, oh, which way should I go? Because it never occurs to you to turn around and go back. It's not that you can't go back, but in fact, if you change the meaning of it and you're talking about roads as unfolding in time, of course, the crucial thing about these temporal choices that you can't go back. You can't undo where you came from. You are what you are because of where you came from. So the you who's making the choice has been constituted by where you came from. The idea that now you can go back and undo that isn't possible for a human being. To act as though it is possible places you so in control of your fate that it looks as though you can make yourself who you are. And in fact, although we tell ourselves that all the time, it's just poppycock. The person who's making the choice has been formed on the basis of past experiences. It doesn't mean that we're all enslaved to that experience, and indeed people with similar experiences will choose differently. But the idea that you can sort of lift yourself up and pretend that you're a completely independent, free being who can be whatever you want to, as though it has nothing to do with who you were, where you were born, what language you're, it's like, I hope there are no Ayn Randians but I remember reading her when I was young, and for a little while being caught up in it. It's so perfect the way she sets out the virtues of selfishness. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. What about language? Where did that come from? I didn't make that up. I mean, I'm born into a language. Where does that language come from? It's not created by me. I can learn new languages and I can change my understanding of my own language, but by the time I'm old enough to know what language is, I mean, in order to think at all, I have to be thinking in a language. That's the road I walk down in order to get to the point where I can make a choice. And it looks as though Oedipus is longing to be autonomous, generally above it all, and generally objective, and as decent as he can possibly be, forces him to assume that it's possible for him to what? To, in a way, generate himself. Well, the metaphor for that is kill your dad, sleep with your mom, and then you're self-generated. You're not, of course, doesn't work, but it's as close as you can get in the temporal world to doing that. Yeah, I think that's the one time, every other reference to it indeed the one directly after it. So you could say the appropriate generalization is this. Oedipus always refers to it as a parting of three roads. Jocasta once refers to it as that, and I think 2 or 3 other times refers to it as a parting, as a fork in the road. So that makes that instance particularly interesting and, worth thinking about. I don't have an answer for that question, but I think it's a really good question.